What's up, everybody? At long last, welcome back to Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your Nuclear Barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I am back from hiatus. Thank you for being patient. I'm very excited for the upcoming episodes that we have. We're keeping it international, folks. We've got our Latin American correspondent, Juan David Rojas, back to talk about Brazil, and that's going to be a good time. And then I believe in the next 2 weeks, we will have a wonderful conversation with a whip smart young person about nuclear in Jamaica. So keep your ears open and your eyes peeled for that in your inbox. For now, Juan, welcome back. How the hell are you?
Great, Emmett. Thanks for having me back on.
I'm really excited about this. So just so everybody knows, if you want to take a look at this before you listen to the episode, you don't have to read it beforehand, but it might help. Juan has just published a piece in American Affairs called "The Center That Will Always Hold Brazil's Lost Decades." It's a fantastic deep dive into everything from wild high court shenanigans to industrial policy failures in Brazil. It is quite substantial. So substantial that I was like, well, we got to get him on. He did a similar treatment for Mexico, and that was the first time you came on, but you can find that, everyone, in the show notes. So definitely check that out either before or after this. For now, I think we need to start with some, where are we at with Brazil right now? Let me tell you what I know a little bit about what's going on in Brazil. Lula's back after the Lava Jato, or however you pronounce it. He is back. Also, Brazil had its own version of January 6th on January 8th, a year or two later. But Bolsonaro wasn't even in the country. He was doing things like eating Sbarro pizza in Florida and getting COVID for the 60th time. I don't think anybody has gotten COVID more than that man.
Only AMLO.
Oh, yeah, AMLO. And I know that Petrobras is insiders have leaked to Reuters that they're looking to do some more gas discovery and try to get some more of that stuff out of the ground. So that's sort of their next upcoming play. I don't know when they're doing that. I pulled it up here so that I could talk about it, but this is from Reuters. Brazilian state-run oil company Petrobras is negotiating 7 new natural gas supply contracts for the coming years, according to sources that told Reuters. The contracts cover 3 gas projects and mark the latest push to reduce prices, currently at around $12 million per BTU. So that's what I know.
Drill.
Drill, baby, drill. That's what Petrobras is up to. So fill in some gaps for me here. What are we looking at when we're looking at Brazil today?
All right. Well, as you just mentioned, Emmett, I'm sure a lot of listeners, the headlines they've seen out of Brazil recently were regarding the really contentious 2022 election between the leftist Lula and right-wing Bolsonaro. Lula won, which is really historic in that he was a former president. He was jailed, and now is back again for a 3rd term, which is really incredible. Bolsonaro, he bet all these lies that the election would be rigged against him. Obviously, only if he lost. If he won,
right.
And said that the voting machines couldn't be trusted. And what's funny is that, here January 6th, Trump was still in office.
Mm-hmm.
In Brazil, Lula was already inaugurated, and the presidents were inaugurated on the 1st of January. And 8 days later, thousands of Bolsonaro supporters stormed all the seats of power in the Brazilian capital. And I mean, chaos is not good enough of a word. But anyway, my piece talks about all of that and Lula, Bolsonaro, and how they've contributed to a lot of Brazil's recent instability and importantly, the country's deindustrialization. I was reading, I think on Substack or one of the descriptions of the podcast, that industrial history is actually a component.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I
Whenever we
figured
can,
this was
which is why I was so stoked that we could talk about some industrial history for Brazil. And it seems like there are some like real themes, not just like Latin American themes, but global themes that play out in Brazil. I know the guys over at Alpha Bunga Bunga, not just because Alex Hochschuli is living in Sao Paulo, but because Brazil and because of their
go back and
patrons.
forth with him on Twitter. Some he's great,
Yeah, yeah. And
and I cited him in the piece.
yeah, yeah, his excellent piece on Brazilianization. So it's sort of like Italy and Brazil are their touchstones for countries that can sort of like help you predict the future a little bit. You know, when
rest
things
in
go
peace,
wrong there, they tend to,
Berlusconi.
yeah, exactly, sort of prefigure what's going to happen. So my understanding is that, I mean, obviously it still has state-run entities, Petrobras, et cetera. But of course, very few have made it out of the last 3 decades unscathed. So give me the lowdown. How were these major state juggernauts formed? Who formed them? What was their context?
Right. So, you know, you look at Brazil, and of its 20 largest companies, 10 either were once or are still state owned. Petrobras is a great example of that. It's actually Brazil's largest company. Um, but so the argument I make in the piece, which there's kind of layers to it, is that Brazil used to be a middling manufacturing power. And that's actually kind of unique in Latin America. Between the 1930s until the 90s, in most cases, most countries in Latin America practice what's called import substitution industrialization. What that means is that you block products that otherwise would be imported with native goods. And so it's protectionist policy meant to promote domestic industry. You could call it a kind of America or Brazil first type of
Right.
politics. That's essentially what industrial policy always means. And every developed country at one point or another did ISI. The thing is that later they did free trade. But anyway, um, in most cases, unfortunately, in Latin American countries during the 20th century, they industrialized their mining, agricultural, and energy sectors. Mexico is a great example of this during the 20th century. It has these glorious energy companies, are so glorious now, but they were more glorious in the past, like Pemex. But Brazil was different in that it prioritized high value sectors in manufacturing, beefing up, for instance, its automotive and aircraft sectors, rather than just industrializing mining, culture, and energy. But they did do that. And both of these things are important. Just that today, the bulk of Brazil's economy is focused on mining, agriculture, oil,
Mm.
et cetera. But you need, in order to become a rich country to develop, you need both of these things. You need a Petrobras because heavy industry needs energy. And this is why someone like Petro in my native Colombia is really stupid, at least on that. But since the 90s in Brazil, there have been these discrete decisions by policymakers to shun industrial policy and manufacturing and instead promote those same extractive sectors, in addition to small business and construction. And the result today is that Brazil still has a comparatively strong manufacturing sector compared to the rest of Latin America, country like say Peru. But the share of the economy in manufacturing is much less than it was in the past. And depending on the specific sector, it's either stagnant or shrinking.
Hmm.
Instead, most of Brazil's economy today, like I said, it consists of exporting primary products, both mineral and agricultural, soy, and oil or and so this is the result of an elite consensus often called neoliberalism. The narrative you hear from economists regarding Brazil and Latin America overall is that ISI was malicious and a failure, bred cronyism and corruption, kept afloat industries that wouldn't survive otherwise. And some of that is true. But so the solution was that government can pick winners and losers, get government out of the way and let the market
Right.
do its work.
And
Which,
trim the fat, right? That
yeah,
sort of, yeah, get it
it's
a little
theoretically
leaner, a little
more,
meaner.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
theoretically more efficient. But the thing is, and they never talk about this. You look at it in economic growth, and almost all of these countries would like double the current rate of the past 20, 30 years. And they're still cronyism. If anything, it's worse. And the economy of a country like Brazil is far less diversified than it was in the past. It's more prone to shocks and fluctuations in commodity prices. All of this is to say that, and it's kind of the conclusion that I want to hammer home, that industrial policy is hard. When it is successful, it takes not years, but decades. But in my opinion, we have a duty to try to boost strategic sectors and companies. To me, the whole state versus market dichotomy doesn't really make sense. I mean, you can have industrial policy with private companies. Obviously, that's what we're doing with like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction. Um, but you definitely need a strategy. And, it turns out when you just leave the market alone to do its work, sometimes the results are that great.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's such a devastating blow to go from having a thriving mid manufacturing sector to just doing energy and resources. I mean, an energy resource economy is like highly vulnerable
Yeah.
because you're totally dependent on your buyers, basically. And if they're having a bad time, you're having a really bad time because their demand destruction is growth destruction for you. There's no cushion to sort of keep you stable. So, all right, let's talk about like some of what goes down here. Um, let's talk about nuclear in Brazil. I want to know about that. You tell me about
Yeah.
that, man. I don't know anything about nuclear in Brazil, and so I really want to know.
Oh
Tell me the
man.
story.
Okay. Perfect. Well, we are on the Nuclear Barbarians podcast, so I think it's definitely appropriate. I did a lot of
That's right.
research just for this topic.
Oh man, I appreciate it.
First, to give some background, and this will be useful for all the companies that we talk about. You look at industrialization in Brazil, and everything goes back to kind of like we talked about in Mexico with Macero Cardenas. In Brazil, an equally important figure is Getulio Vargas, who was a really fascinating figure. He was both a democratic president and a dictator at one point, and kind of straddled the line between being kind of like a right wing fascist, honestly, while he was a dictator. Um, and he, like Lula, came back for a third term. He was democratically elected, and during the term, he was kind of like a left wing populist. But he said on
Wild.
the period of ISI policies in the form of tariff protection, managed trade, sectoral unionization, a state development bank, um, state-owned steel companies, the state-owned oil firm Petrobras, and in a lot of these cases, so in the long term, these industries were all successful. The one case of a serious failure of industrial policy, unfortunately, is in nuclear. Um,
Hard sector to get right.
yeah, and unfortunately, the really what did end the sector was incompetence. To be honest, there was a lot of scandals, and the scandals were twofold. On the one hand, there were a lot of accidents and problems in the handling of nuclear materials, not even just relating to nuclear power, just like mining and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And related to nuclear proliferation for nuclear weapons because of the military dictatorship was key in developing the nuclear industry and a lot of industry overall in Brazil.
Gotcha. Okay.
But so during Vargas's presidency, a really interesting dude, listeners should check out also the guy called Alberto da Mota e Silva. He was a vice admiral and Brazilian inventor who was on Brazil's National Security Council called the GSM. And he had a number of proposals that Vargas approved to begin investigating, researching, and acquiring materials and technologies for the development of a nuclear industry. This was approved in 53. And related government agencies, it's a whole alphabet soup of agencies involved in all of this. Sought to acquire nuclear tech from the US and other developed countries. A long-standing partnership started with West Germany that lasted decades. One of Vargas's successors, Juscelino Kubitschek, he actually under him, Brasilia was built. He founded the National Nuclear Energy Commission, as well as the
Gotcha.
Atomic Energy Institute in Sao Paulo that had Brazil's first reactor, which is the first to enter operation in the Southern Hemisphere.
Well, so that's probably like a test reactor, right? I'm
Yeah,
guessing
yeah.
for, yeah, okay.
And one of the problems was that, countries like the US didn't want Brazil and other countries. I mean, still, we're trying to thwart Iran and whatnot, but this is historical. Developed countries kind of had a suspicious eye on anyone who wanted to develop a nuclear industry. And the next progress that Brazil saw in nuclear came when the military took over in '64. They ramped up research and development in nuclear, and that caused a lot of friction with the U.S. because the military refused to sign off on a non-proliferation treaty. And they had a Cold War mentality, as a national security concern. They wanted to develop nuclear, and they had a bit of a rivalry and arms race with Argentina, which was doing the same. I wrote this down at a national security meeting. One of the military dictators at the time, Costa and Silva, he said, quote, he's the voice of argument, said, quote, doing research, mining and building devices that can explode, and added, we will not call them bombs. We will call them devices that can explode.
I love it. So I didn't know about this whole arms race between Argentina and Brazil. That is fascinating that those two countries were competing for nuclear arms with each other. And I love the devices that explode line. That's I love that's such a great workaround. The pure political ease. So
It gets kind of better. And then later, Brazil and Argentina agreed to cooperate and sharing information on nuclear. In the '70s, there were the energy and oil shocks, and that catalyzed a lot of further interest in developing nuclear on the grounds of energy sovereignty. A contract with Westinghouse and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was approved in '71 for the supply of nuclear fuel for Brazil's first nuclear plant, Angra 1, which is located in Rio. And in '74, Nuclearbras, which was the state-owned nuclear company, was founded. In that same year, India tested its first nuclear weapon, and that really caused a panic in the U.S. And Carter took over later, and he was really stringent on not wanting to support nuclear anywhere outside of the U.S. Brazil then turned to France and Germany, and West Germany committed to export reactors over the course of 15 years. This is really significant at the time of as a transfer from a developed country to a developing one. And in cooperation with West Germany, Brazil's second reactor, Angra 2, began in 1976. 10 years later, Angra 1 was finally finished in 1985. And this is to give you an idea of some of the problems. Between 82 and 92, Angra was halted 16 times for a load of different reasons.
Oh boy, that is a tough record. That is a tough record.
Westinghouse itself actually said that they thought their investment was a poor decision. And due to the constant interruptions, Brazilians call the plant a vagalume, a firefly.
Oh man. So just a real quick on the India one. So around the '70s, this is an interesting note when Carter was like, we're not doing nuclear anymore. India was into testing like that. India was also powerfully interested, as it is today, in civilian nuclear.
Yep.
And one American senator was hell-bent to make sure that India never got it. And that was Ed Markey. And he did everything in his power to make sure. And he wrote a whole book on it. It's out of print.
Oh.
Yeah, that was his victory lap about stopping the construction of civilian nuclear wherever he could in the developing world. So I forget what it's called, but you can sort of it's like one of those things where you can only look at the cover on Amazon used, and every 6 months, a used copy can show up. I've been meaning to pick it up, but
very interesting. Yeah.
So that's just a nice little detail there. So back to this firefly, I take it the industry is not super beloved in Brazil.
And actually, this is the part of the podcast where I'm going to have to excuse myself. with you because I feel this might be a poor taste on a nuclear a podcast. I'm going to talk about some of the accidents.
No, no, no. Please,
Right
we
on
must. Yeah.
if you haven't heard about the Goiás incident, it's called Brazil's Chernobyl. I definitely recommend you look into it, listeners, as well. Is this insane case in the city of Goiás? It's kind of a central, the capital of a central state in Brazil. This is really, I'm just going to say it's Banana Republic stuff. And what's
Yeah.
funny is that it actually doesn't even relate directly to nuclear power. No, not even at all to nuclear power. In 1985, a hospital in the city of Goiás left um, a, a radiology capsule filled with cesium-137. This was used to treat like cancer patients at blast a controlled dose of the
Hmm.
cesium for the treatment. And they relocated. And for 2 whole years, this cesium was sitting there. There's like a correspondence of some people working at the hospital. Like, hey, we left the cesium back there. Probably do something about that.
Probably go get it.
And then some people were taken to jail. They posted a security guard there to make sure no one, got into the abandoned hospital. But it just so happened that one day in 1987, the security guard didn't show up. And these were
Oh.
two burglars, they're sometimes called scavengers, went into the abandoned hospital, found the capsule, thought it was something valuable, and took it home, started trying to pry it open. They started throwing up and they were like, oh, we probably ate something. They got it open. They found this beautiful blue shining powder inside. We're like, wow, this is
Oh.
really sold it to this scrapyard guy. And he brought it home, and his daughter thought it was like beautiful fairy dust. She like put it on in like her hair, and like her
Oh.
brother like put it over her chest. She died. Um, and the burglar is also one of them. Like his hands reportedly swelled up to like the size of like a bowling ball. But they actually incredibly survived. Anyway, just like, being passed around through the town. Something like 100 and something people were thought to have come in contact with it. Eventually, I think the mother, the wife of the scrapyard guy realized that it was the
The
dust.
cesium. Yes.
And she went to a hospital. Someone at the hospital realized that this was radioactive. But the guy kind of was like, "What the hell is going on? Where is this little?"
Oh man.
Um, and this caused a national panic. The entire town was shut down. Around 120,000 people were hurried into the stadium and tested and cleaned up, scraped down. Only 4 people died, but I mean, for the last terrible thing about this, when the girl that died was being buried, the town people came out to protest, not because they were upset that she died. They didn't want her being buried because they thought she was radioactive. Um,
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, I imagine that, you know, information on radioactivity is pretty low. All you know is that it's scary and related
yeah, yep,
to the enormous bombs. It's already had this effect. Shutting down the town has only ratcheted it up the fear.
uh-huh.
Everybody has mishandled this in almost every single way that they could.
Yeah, and you talked about this. I mean, yeah, in the U.S., but obviously in Brazil, the nuclear industry isn't always honest or good at educating people about
Yeah.
exactly how this stuff works. But yeah, later like people were taken to trial over this, and I think one of the nuclear agencies was sued because they didn't dispose properly of the cesium. But it's funny, yeah, because it doesn't relate directly to nuclear energy, but it's definitely mismanagement of nuclear materials. On top of that, there were a lot of problems, yeah, that I mentioned in Angra 1. And a year before in '86, something like 20,000 liters of radioactive water leaked from the plant. Um, this was a huge scandal. This happened again in 2001. Uh, I won't go into some of the other cases, but yeah, the mining of nuclear materials was also really problematic.
Yeah, I'm sure if that's how they handled a small cesium problem, that the way that they handled mining was not the best. So, okay, what I see here is that we have sort of an industrial failure that centers around major political problems in Brazil that has to do with a lack of accountability and trust between government, major industries, and the people. Um, that all sounds like a huge bummer and sort of par for the course. Like I said, getting a nuclear industry right is really, really hard. As you can tell, even the most developed countries in the world have mishandled their own nuclear industries and they've been on the back foot for all sorts of reasons. But let's uh let's sort of like move around the industrial sector here. Let's talk. Oh yeah.
One thing though, just to close the loop on nuclear. And as I mentioned before, another thing that kind of derailed it was the fact that there was this like secret program for nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
Funnily enough, in the 80s, the head of one of the nuclear agencies traveled to communist China, and Brazil was a right wing military dictatorship at the time, to get enriched uranium from Chinese counterparts.
Man.
And when civilian rule was reestablished in '85, there was a lot of commissions that investigated the stuff, and a lot of revelations really discredited the industry. In the '90s, Brazil's first democratically elected president, who was impeached over corruption scandals. But anyway, he had a link for a conversation. He kicked off a spree of mass privatizations, contributed to deindustrialization, and he renounced nuclear power. He said that the plants that were there could be kept, but no further development of nuclear would be had. And um, Angra 2 was finally finished in 2001. And Lula actually then launched a new nuclear energy plan. He tried to revive the program under his government in 2010. A third plant at Angra started being built in 2010. Unfortunately, still hasn't been finished. I saw somewhere that at one point it was supposed to be finished this year, but that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And the end result of all of this is that Br- Brazil, 3% of its energy comes from nuclear. And actually half of Rio's, because the two plants
Oh
are in,
yeah.
come from nuclear power. In a way, you could argue that it's still a success and that Brazil has nuclear power, whereas
Mhm.
the rest of Latin America doesn't. But I mean, that's not saying much.
Yeah, yeah, your mileage may vary. So, okay, that is God, what a twisting, turning tale.
Yeah.
Man. Okay. So, let's pivot to another industrial sector, one that nuclear is intimately related to. Let's talk about Eletrobras, which is another one of these state behemoths that of course, as it did in America, as it has in Japan, as it has in Australia, as it has all over Europe, runs into restructuring right around the 90s. Tell me the tale of Eletrobras.
The 90s electrical group thing.
Yeah.
So, nuclear is kind of exceptional, and will be exceptional in our conversation in that, by design, nuclear has to be, there has to be an industrial policy for nuclear. You're not going to have a mom and pop shop,
Yeah.
nuclear, uh, gig that's going to get up and running and, power a whole country. But in the case of the other companies that we're going to talk about, there's the kind of a dichotomy in that some of these are a success of the state or of industrial policy, and then are also a success of like market reforms or failures of the market. Electrobras was definitely a success of industrial policy, but a failure of the free market. And so, as you referenced, um, first, some history, the company was founded in '62 by Juan Goulart, one of Vargas' democratic successors. He was the president that was overthrown by the military dictatorship. And this took time, as with all these other companies, but it's a really successful utility, succeeded in lowering electricity prices for ordinary Brazilians below rates of the global average. Um, but beginning in the '90s, in '95, the Brazilian government privatized the electricity sector, and it still kept some control and majority control in Eletrobras. But the idea was, let's open this up to competition. Let's have the state-owned company compete with other companies, or at least the different chains of the grid and distribution or whatever. And this will be more efficient. Well, in the electricity sector, that doesn't work that way. Actually, competition creates more regulation and makes it more inefficient. It's a natural monopoly. That doesn't make sense. So, yeah, just a year later, prices rose 15%. And by 2006, they increased by 200%.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so some
Oh
estimates
my
today,
God.
some estimates today rate Brazil as having some of the highest electricity prices in the world. The Brazil State Development Bank, the BNDES, describes itself a privatization as a failure. And last year under Bolsonaro, they doubled down and said, you know what the problem was? We didn't privatize enough. So
Enough.
they
Yeah.
sold off even more of the company. Now the government has this became an electoral issue. Actually, the government only had the 40% share of the company, and they said that this would reduce electricity bills by a whole 7%. And obviously, prices have gone up. It's not certain, I mean, there's been the Ukraine war and other stuff.
Sure. There's a lot of noise in that data. Yeah.
If that's it, but Lula came out against it, said he wanted to renationalize Eletrobras. But actually, under Bolsonaro, they put up a lot of conditions that a huge fine would have to be paid if the company is renationalized. Kind of sinister.
Yeah, it's in the billions too, right? It's something like 20 billion, between
Yeah,
15
yeah,
and 20 billion, something like that, which is steep. You're basically saying like you have to pay this blood debt if you want on top of whatever it costs to buy back these assets. And nobody wants to be like, okay, day one, I'm going to sink a bunch of political capital and actual capital to
exactly.
do something that I'm not sure will work, even if it's something that I want. So yeah, I need to find somebody who can do a whole global restructuring task. I've yet to find the general global electricity historian. Maybe I'll have to become one. But I'm very fascinated.
Well, like which which countries didn't like privatize their electricity sectors and compare them? It's like, hey, yeah, look, this is definitive. Please don't do this.
Yeah, or I mean, when you look at Europe, there's also like um there's the EU market, and then there's like what each country has within it. And so you get weird stuff, sort of like the United States in that way. You have like traditional utility areas or public utility areas that are inside of these larger market structures. So it's a very tricky tapestry. Um, but it's not all for nothing. We've had some successes, right? In Brazil, some things
Mhm.
have gone right. Tell me about those. What's one of the ones we can talk about? Let
All
me see
right.
if I can pronounce this right. Right? What's it called? Embraer.
Yes, that's exactly right.
All right.
Embraer is the shining success story, not just of Brazil, but all of Latin America. It is
Wow.
the at Embraer manufactures planes for both
Okay.
Brazil's military and in the commercial sector. It's a high value manufacturing company that competes with multinational competitors like Bombardier, Canadian company around the world, and is profitable, successful. I mean, the you know the goal I think is that it would be nice if other countries like Colombia and Mexico had some kind of company
Mm,
equivalent. And that said, unfortunately, Embraer is still like compared to Brazil's largest company. I think it's like the 20 something 30th biggest company in Brazil. But but it's an important company. It was founded in 1969 by the Brazilian Air Force during the military dictatorship, and its initial goals were linked to national defense. For the military, obviously, that makes sense.
mhm,
A lot of the background goes back as always to Vargas and some of the institutes for aviation um, in Brazil's military going back to the 30s. Uh, but so again, it took Embraer decades to become profitable and successful. Initially, military rule and insulated the company from special interests. And state protection meant that the company could survive, on communism, for many years on subsidies, despite being unprofitable. But the thing is, the subsidies had a strategic goal in mind to improve production, and research and learning through trial and error over time allowed the company to develop its own models for regional mid-sized jets that later turned out to be really competitive. And what's interesting is this: when Embraer it was privatized in the 90s, in 94, and it had to be put up for auction, I think 5 times, and on the sixth, it was finally sold. It was viewed as so um, uh, undesirable because of its financials that it took so long to sell it. Um, and the new ownership today, I had like a shock doctrine. They slashed wages, deunionized a lot of the workforce, outsourced a lot of the workforce, eliminated around half of it in 95. But kind of by chance, because they made that earlier investment into mid-sized jets, that was a sector that took off during the 90s. The company became hugely successful. So chance is a big part of it, but privatization did help for collaboration with multinational private companies. But I mean, an important thing also is that the military and the government kept a golden share. That means that they have a seat as the permanent seat of the company's board, in permanent ownership, partial ownership of the company. It wasn't completely privatized. Initially, the state was stipulated that foreign ownership couldn't exceed more than 40%. The military was really keen
Mm.
to not have the company be completely sold out. And
Sure.
the truth is that if they completely sold out the company, there's little reason to believe that it would have survived as a Brazilian company. It would have been
Yeah, it would have been
likely
something else.
acquired by
Yeah.
Bombardier or Boeing or Wells.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's such a fascinating story. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, basically the before privatization, they had invested a lot in mid-size jets and jet engines. And then they get bought at auction. We see the typical deunionization, outsourcing, slashing, putting things into deals with contractors rather than being totally vertically integrated. But it is that pre-privatized investment that pays off.
Exactly. If
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure I had the timeline right because that is a really interesting twist of events. That's a nice twist of fate. That's
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
so
it's pure luck, and this will come up later. The thing is, because privatization was done on purely ideological grounds, because I'm not actually completely against privatization. I think there are moments where it makes sense.
sure.
Um, it's just that because it's not done like strategically, it's just done ideologically. It means that no matter what in the 90s, these companies would be privatized. If they don't have their shit together at the moment of privatization, they're going to get destroyed. But
Right, right.
it didn't have the case that previous investment really paid off. And to give some recent history, I mentioned this in the piece. Horribly, Bolsonaro was in the military, and he's really proud of Brazil's armed forces. One of the first things he did was sell off Embraer to Boeing. Boeing acquired a huge part of it.
No way.
Embraer still survived again by chance because Boeing couldn't go through with the acquisition in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic.
Get out, man. That is wild,
Yeah.
son. Wow, how crazy. So they still have their golden share. They still have their 40% or what?
Yeah, yeah. I think over time it's been reduced, but yeah,
Yeah.
the government still has some ownership.
Okay. Wow. Okay. All right. And then let's talk about what we started with, right? I brought about some news about Petrobras. Everybody knows that natural gas is sort of the big deal right now. I'll be interested to see if Petrobras, not only do they want to cater the domestic side, but everybody wants LNG now. I don't know what they're thinking about there. I don't know if you know, but before we can even touch on that, we need the story, dog.
The big
So
boy,
let's have it. Yeah, the big
the,
boy.
the big boy, Petrobras. Again, and this one goes directly back to Vargas. Vargas, like Cardenas in Mexico, we talked about last time, he nationalized the oil sector. And found, and Petrobras was founded in 53 in his third term. And this was important, but it's not quite as momentous as in Mexico. In Mexico, the Pemex is really key to the Mexican psyche. It's a bit different in Brazil.
Yeah, they got a holiday for Cardenas there.
Uh-huh. But Petrobras, again, it took years to become profitable. It wasn't profitable until the 1980s. So this took decades. Brazil's oil reserves are located offshore in deep sea wells that are really difficult to access with the technology from back then. As a result, they had to heavily invest in exploration related research since the 50s. And then eventually you get to the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the company finally took off. By the 2000s, Petrobras had more patents than any other Brazilian institution, and today is Brazil's largest company. It's extremely profitable and has investments and partnerships all over the world. If you go to a lot of countries in Latin America, you'll see Petrobras pumps. And all of this kind of despite the huge scandal that the company had during the 2010s with the, as you mentioned, the Lava Jato investigations and the
Lava Jato, that's what it is.
scandal, the kickbacks.
Yeah. So for I think I have many Anglo or at least American listeners, though I do have a high amount of people from all over the world. So happy about that. Happy to have a very international podcast here over at Nuclear Barbarians. But that means the car wash, which I love as a turn of phrase for a corruption scandal. And you have some great details in your piece about Lava Jato. I found myself actually laughing at certain junctures because it is so ridiculous. So, can you encapsulate what happens with Petrobras and Lava Jato for us?
Yeah. Okay. Where to begin? So
Where to begin?
It's called Operation Car Wash because they were laundering a lot of the stolen money at a car station, the pumps. And the scheme was that construction and infrastructure projects for Petrobras, which the companies that built this out were Brazil's construction companies. Odebrecht is the most famous, but others like OAS and Camargo Correa. Anyway, they were over. This is a classic scheme. You skim up the top from overproduction. So you say, okay, I'm going to build, whatever, this building, and it's set to cost this much. Whoops, it ended up costing double, and I get to keep half of that excess amount.
Yes, of course.
And so a lot of this corruption was kind of used to keep the incumbent government afloat. The kickbacks were ridiculous. It all came crashing down because Brazil before 2012 didn't have plea bargaining. And that proved really key. Through plea bargaining, they were able to arrest some of these company executives and get them through pleas to reveal key information that allowed them to take down a lot of the operation.
Man. And so this redounds through
that's a simplified version, but it's
no. I think that's great. And so this sort of like reverberates through. This is basically how they start going after Lula and his whole establishment. You have some great stuff in here. I don't think we have time for it now. Again, people, you have to read it because like the description of like how Brazilian politics works, it is just so alien.
It's a nightmare.
The American system.
You think it's bad here, it's way worse there.
Yeah, that like even rough comparisons don't really make sense at an institutional level. But basically, that corruption scandal launches the whole sort of insurgent right in Brazil, and it's a big Bolsonarismo show, and Bolsonaro, of course, show up. And they're like, we're going to handle this corruption. That is not what happens. He gets co-opted by this entity, the Brazilian Centro Central, which you do a great job of describing. But let's talk about where does that leave after all of this, right? Because we've had this big dent in Lula. He's in prison now. He's back, baby. Bolsonaro is doing whatever he's doing.
I don't know if you
Bolsonarismo
saw
still kind of exists,
the
but
big news is that last week he was stripped by the Supreme Court, the electoral court specifically, of his political rights. He can't run for office for 8 years. Pretty much mean he's dead. He's done.
wow, it is over. And so, but I know that there are still people that are basically like, similarly, we still have, no matter what happens to Donald Trump, we will still have Trump loyalists, right? Trumpism will live on, right?
Mhm.
You can kill the man, but not the idea, Juan, is
Yeah.
what I'm trying to tell you. Um, so let's sort of update all of this. What are we looking at in Brazilian energy and industry today after all of this fanfare?
So, I've actually been a bit surprised because Lula obviously was really big into Petrobras and energy, actually. He was a former union leader. Really, uh, Petrobras exploded in the 2000s. He authorized a ton of projects. And I had a feeling that in his third term, he would be a little bit more hostile to the oil sector, because there's all this push for renewables
Mhm.
and climate ideology, which I'm sympathetic to. I just hate it when it's stupid.
Yeah.
Petro before, but Ben and Lula's message, one of his core pitches during the election, was on environmentalism, on
Mm.
the Amazon and combating climate change. And actually, amazingly, some other great news that came out a few days ago or last week from his administration. He's managed to cut deforestation already in his first 6 months by 30%.
Wow, that's fantastic. Good for him.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
fantastic. But while doing that, he has authorized a ton of energy projects, including with Petrobras, a lot of which are who have been really pissed off environmentalists. I send you an article in a Brazilian newspaper. I don't know if you got a chance to see it.
Oh yeah, remind
Yeah.
me.
I was trying to, you would have had to use like Google Translate, but the translation I thought was actually pretty good. But he just listed a number of projects that Lula authorized, including like a highway through the Amazon,
Right.
um, drilling for Petrobras near the mouth of the Amazon, which that one actually does seem kind of controversial. But most of them seemed innocuous to me, seem good and probably will help the country. But environmentalists were just losing their
Oh,
shit.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And
Yeah. How could you? Well, there's no pleasing them. So that, I mean, it heartens me to hear that. It heartens me to hear that sort of like AMLO isn't alone in supporting the state oil thing. I mean, he's got a whole, people can go back and listen to our episode on that. You really should, because the situation that Pemex is in is not easy. And AMLO's sort of betting big on a hometown, uh, what we all hope is not a vanity project. So that's a really interesting tale. But when we look at the whole Latin American scene with industry and energy, like, are there any trends that us energy people and industry people want to be aware of that you're noticing?
well, let's go over to the other side, the really reprehensible case.
Okay.
Petro in Colombia.
Yeah. I feel like we're getting some foreshadowing about who we're going to talk about. So who's Petro for listeners that don't know?
He's the current president of Colombia. He's Colombia's first leftist president. Colombia famously um, uh, only just elected a leftist, was historically a really right wing
Mhm.
country. And he actually has a message that's really similar to Lula and AMLO. In a lot of ways, he's a left wing nationalist and prioritizes industry. Hasn't really gone anywhere. Very current government. But unfortunately, it's kind of mixed up in that while he like wants Colombia to industrialize, he also just despises its energy sector, its oil sector specifically. He has
Yeah.
vision for their oil exploration, and that is really, really killing off interest from investors. it's dumb because he has this maniacal attitude that's like, we're going to be dead in 12 years, classic stuff. We need to do
Yeah, yeah,
everything possible and invest in renewables. It's like, dude, Colombia like gets a ton of its energy from hydroelectric dams and like
yeah. What are you worried
Ecopetrol,
about?
the state oil company. Like, there's an argument there that most of the country's finances, the revenues for the government come from that company. And that makes it really vulnerable to oil shocks. But, if you just try to kill it off, it just makes things worse.
Yeah,
And
especially if you're not offsetting that with some other type of investment. I also see that he's really brought the hammer down. I think I remember reading this. I don't know if we've talked about it, but I've talked to another Colombian friend of mine about this. But he's really come down on coal mining as well,
yeah, yeah,
in the country.
fracking.
Um,
To be fair, fracking is really unpopular in the country. Even some of the right wing candidates last year, I remember, came out against it. And
so is
maybe
there
they
a
would have
reason?
authorized it in the end, but
Yeah, is there a reason for that? Like, it's like I can understand because coal um, just uses a ton of land. And I get why someone would be like, okay, we'll do oil, we'll do this, but we won't do coal. I can understand that, but to say we won't do fracking, I mean, I have an American bias towards fracking. I'm like, it's great. What are you worried about? So what's the concern in Colombia?
I haven't looked too much into it really deeply. But I imagine that the point that's always raised is that it contaminates the water.
Gotcha.
I imagine that the way it's been done probably hasn't been up to par. So yeah,
Mm,
there's a lot of animosity from local communities against it.
okay. I can get that. I'm not going to speak on the Colombian situation and what they should or shouldn't do with fracking because I don't know how their particular industry handles it. I think that's very interesting. And so yeah, Petro seems to have some very strange ideas. He was very hard on the renewables, climate apocalypticism. Is he alone in Latin America with that, or there are others like him?
Yeah, it's funny. There is definitely a mix right now. Most of Latin America's leaders are on the left. Don't hold your breath. Conservatives that are listening, this will change. Give it a few years. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, there are, yeah, leaders like Petro and Boric in Chile who are hard on. I don't know as much about Chile. I don't know if Boric is outright hostile to like the oil sector, for
Mm,
instance. And Chile is really big on mining, so I think he just kind of had to been forced to authorize a lot of
yeah.
that. But let me think who else. Oh yeah, Almo is a baby drill guy. So I mean,
Yeah, he loves it. He loves it. And even after we talked, Pemex and his or not Pemex, the what's the electric company, the national electric company?
CFP.
CFE has bought up even more foreign assets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the foreign owned assets. So they are sort of centralizing a lot of stuff right now. So, um, I mean, I think it'll be interesting. Like Latin American politics stays surprising and also completely unsurprising at the same time. It's got that nice parallax quality going on to it. To it.
In Argentina, they have been moving forward with that Vaca Muerta project, which you might know more about. It's what is it? Is it an LNG or is it like
Oh, right, right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's an LNG terminal. I haven't seen anything about it in a while, but I know that they're going ahead with some projects.
Mhm. So, and for instance, Bolivia, the really hard left Bolivian government is really into the natural gas sector, and is that actually, yeah, kind of hostile to the renewables.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I really think that we're going to see a lot of that. I think that so my just sort of licking my finger and sticking it out and seeing where the wind blows thing going right now is that we're going to see a lot of countries all over the world, depending on where they are, get really friendly with either coal or with gas. If they have big gas reserves and they have the industry to do it, I think they're going to get down with it. If they were in the situation like Pakistan or any of these other countries that really felt the bite of Western hypocrisy in the LNG market last year, they're going to double down on either coal and or nuclear. That's what they're going to do because they
Okay.
want things that have fuel on site, that are abundant, local, and they don't have to worry about Germany coming in and buying them out of the goddamn market after swearing up and down that they're not going to commit to fossil fuels like that. I think that's a very painful lesson to have to learn, and nobody wants to learn it twice. So that's uh, everybody, that is a firm opinion, loosely held. Of course, all predictions are fragile.
I thought it'd be interesting, yeah, if we talked about like comparing Pemex to Petrobras. There's some interesting things.
Yeah, please
Right.
do. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that because I think, uh, I mean, it's sort of like you have two great test cases to contrast and compare.
Yeah, yeah. So going back to the theme, the framework that we had, Petrobras was it definitely a success of the state, but you could also describe it as a success of the market. Conversely, Pemex was a success of industrial policy, and less so with market reforms. Um, so both display what I would call good industrial policy. Hashtag good industrial policy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pemex definitely shows a bad case of free trade. In like, what do I mean by that? So good industrial policy is like when, okay, you condition support on results. We talked about this last time with Pemex. The strategy that was used, Petrobras did something similar. It's usually you use either subsidies or tax breaks. And you say, look, I will cut your taxes if you increase oil production. And so over time, that you reward that good behavior with um, the subsidy or whatever it is. Yeah, bad industrial policy is just the yeah you feed a company that isn't going anywhere forever.
Yeah, it's loyalty, not results.
Uh-huh. But at the same time, there isn't a point where free trade can be smart or market reforms can be smart. When you know that the company is capable of competing with foreign multinationals, it actually might make sense to have it compete with foreign competitors. Um, Interestingly, you could describe Pemex as a kind of victim of its own success. We talked about this before because its oil reserves were more easily accessible, and as a result, they were able to be exploited much earlier than Petrobras. Um, when you get to the '90s and industrial policy falls out of favor, there's just this idea. It's like, oh no, the government should stop doing anything, and the market will make the company um, better. The company would then turn into a cash cow, and actually taxes were increased on the company over time on Pemex. And this made it actually, yeah, less productive, and there were some market centric reforms, yeah, selling off subsidiaries. Um, and today, like Pemex is absurdly taxed. This is one of the things Onlo did when he first came in. He
Mhm.
cut taxes to help the company. And I forgot to mention this last time. In the '90s, the Cantarell oil field, which is Mexico's most productive oil field for a long time, dried up. And so to keep Pemex going further, significant investments would need to be made that the company alone wouldn't be able to do. And so production began declining in 2004 and only recently stopped declining under AMLO. And, to make matters worse, then there was the energy reform in 2014, and
Mm.
that caused production and investments to fall and flip even more. And it makes sense because, you know, the company by the '90s is not doing great, and you can see it has serious problems. If you start liberalizing the sector and having it compete with foreign companies, it's not going to work out. Petrobras uh, was having its boom precisely in the '90s, and in that sense, it got lucky. So because it boomed in the '90s and they opened it up to competition, it actually helped. Um, and that's kind of the story of a lot of Latin America, that you liberalize these sectors. This is what happened to Brazil's automotive industry. We talked forever about this actually. Brazil had a really strong indigenous automotive sector. In the 90s, they opened it up to competition with imports. It decimated. Oof. So, and that's what I mean, that free trade was done on ideological and not strategic grounds. There's a moment where free trade might actually help. And so countries like the US, for instance, and yeah, in Europe, uh, they were initially protectionist. And once their companies were at a point where, you know, we knew that they could compete on a global scale, then you do free trade.
Mm, mm. That's really fascinating. Yeah, man, there are all of these little national industries that just get crushed in the 90s. Brazil is not alone in that. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, just an interesting, I really think it's interesting, like what keeps a company disciplined, how it works. And I think what's fascinating to me about what you just said about Petrobras and Pemex is that really the logistical challenges that Petrobras faces in getting its offshore oil together make it a highly disciplined company that doesn't sort of like take for granted what it's doing.
Honestly,
And
exactly.
the
It's kind of
easy
like the resource.
accessibility
It's kind of
of,
like the resource curse within the resource
yeah,
curse.
right, right, exactly. And then Pemex sort of had the opposite thing happen. That's really interesting.
Yeah. One other thing that's really fascinating, Pemex is a completely state-owned company.
Hmm.
Petrobras, over time, since the 90s, the government reduced its share of ownership. It's still majority, and this is something that has been talked about, whether it's privatizing the company even more, which is
Hmm.
even some people on the right are skittish about. Um, but that's important because, in as screwed as Pemex is, interestingly, because of that, it seems as though it's more insulated from fluctuations in the global oil trade. Um, and so I mentioned this in my article about Mexico. You look at the rig count in Mexico and it consistently goes up, even despite things like the COVID-19 pandemic. You look at the rig count numbers here, and like it plummeted
Hmm.
when COVID outbreak began. And like the oil industry, like Biden, Lula has actually also complained that Petrobras is buying a lot of its own stock and not investing enough in this, disincentivizes production, which is a fair point. Pemex does have that problem because it's not a publicly traded company. Petrobras has
Right.
shares on the stock market. And so
Hmm.
there are all these incentives that can be malicious.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so different from what we have here in America. I mean, maybe one day we can get an episode together and we can talk about what the hell is going on in Venezuela and its
Oh my God.
oil company. Because I feel like that. Yeah, you're already laughing. I think that's going to be a wild story, but one we'll have to save for another day. So I'll ask you again. Any concluding thoughts before we say goodbye, my friend?
Well, I think the same thing as last time. Energy matters.
Yep. Energy matters, baby. I love it. We can sign off on that. Juan, thanks again for stopping by. People can find the article um, in the show notes along with Juan's Twitter and his LinkedIn. If you want to reach out to him, please do. He's a guy that knows a lot. And until I see you next time, remember to stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant, my friends. We will see you next time.